The galaxy learned how to be quiet when it decided someone was going to die. Across 13 inhabited systems, alarms screamed, then went silent. Long-range sensors confirmed what everyone already feared. The enemy fleet was real. It was vast, and it was coming fast. The coalition worlds had done everything right. They had followed the treaties, paid their tribute, obeyed the council's laws. When the first border station vanished, they sent warnings. When the second system went dark, they begged for aid. By the time the third sun went out, they were screaming. No one answered. In the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council, representatives watched the data streams with cold eyes. The projections were clear. To intervene would cost fleets. To fight would cost worlds. To save the coalition would weaken the empires that mattered. Calculations were made. Votes were cast. The decision was unanimous. Containment only. No intervention. The coalition was officially declared non-viable. In the outer systems, the message arrived without ceremony. A short transmission. Legal language. Final. Aid denied. Evacuation denied. The coalition worlds were advised to maintain order and preserve records for historical review. It was a polite way of saying, prepare to die. On the planet Ilex, Governor Terran stood alone in the broadcast chamber, staring at the words until they blurred. Outside, the sky was red from emergency fires. Refugee ships clogged the atmosphere, all trying to flee through hyperspace lanes already collapsing under enemy interference. There would be no escape. Terran ordered one final transmission, not to the Council, but to the open galactic net. A message unencrypted, unfiltered, and painfully honest. This is Governor Terran of the Ilex Coalition, he said, his voice steady despite everything. We were loyal. We were peaceful. We believed the galaxy would stand together. He paused, knowing no one important was listening. We were wrong. Across multiple worlds, civilians gathered to watch. Not because they expected help, but because it was the last thing they had left. Parents held children. Soldiers stood at attention with weapons they knew would not matter. The enemy fleet appeared as shadows against the stars. Not ships, but moving darkness, blotting out constellations older than recorded history. Sensors struggled to count them. They did not broadcast. They did not threaten. They simply advanced. Military commanders knew the truth. This was not an invasion. It was an erasure. On Ilex, orbital defenses fired first. Bright lines of energy vanished against the enemy's forward hulls. The return fire was instant. Entire platforms ceased to exist, torn apart as if made of dust. The sky burned. As cities shook, Terran continued the broadcast. Let history show that we did not surrender, he said. Let it show that when the galaxy turned away, we stood alone. The feed was picked up by automated relays, bouncing across empty space. It was not meant to be answered. Then something strange happened. On the far edge of the system, where sensors showed only background radiation, a signal appeared. Weak, old, filled with static. At first, Command dismissed it as debris interference. But the signal persisted. It cut through jamming the enemy was known to use. It repeated on a frequency no modern fleet relied on anymore. An ancient channel. A technician froze, staring at the translation software. Sir, this signal has a linguistic match. What species? The commander demanded. The technician swallowed. Human. The room went silent. Humans were a footnote in most databases. A minor species from a quiet arm of the galaxy. They had fought internal wars, failed to expand, and slowly withdrawn from interstellar politics centuries ago. No one had heard from them in generations. The signal strengthened. Words began to form through the static. We are receiving, the voice said. Calm, clear, human. On the bridge, officers stared at the display as if it were a ghost. The voice continued. Coalition forces, we have your broadcast. Enemy weapons fire intensified. Another city vanished in a flash of white light. We are altering course, the human voice said. Arrival imminent. Sensors spiked. New contacts appeared. Dozens, then hundreds, emerging not from known hyperspace lanes, but from vectors that should not exist. Ships of unfamiliar design. Dark hulls scarred with old battle marks. No visible insignia. The enemy fleet hesitated. For the first time since its arrival, it slowed. The human voice returned, now broadcasting openly across all channels, civilian, military, and enemy alike. This is humanity, it said. You were left to die. Human ships moved forward, placing themselves between the coalition worlds and the approaching darkness. You are not alone anymore. The transmission ended, and as the first human vessels opened fire, the galaxy held its breath. The galaxy did not react all at once. At first, there was confusion. Sensor operators across multiple systems flagged anomalies, then quietly assumed their instruments were malfunctioning. Fleets did not simply appear from impossible vectors. Physics did not allow it. History did not allow humans to do it. But the data refused to go away. On the bridge of the lead enemy vessel, something like hesitation rippled through the dark formation. The advance slowed further, not out of fear, but calculation. This was not expected resistance. This was an unknown variable. Behind the human ships, the coalition worlds watched in stunned silence. Governor Terran felt his knees weaken. He gripped the console to stay upright, eyes locked on the tactical display. The new arrivals had taken damage almost immediately. Enemy fire slammed into their forward ranks, tearing through shields and armor. And yet, they did not move aside. They held position. Human ships were not beautiful. They were not sleek or elegant like Council warcraft. They looked heavy, scarred, built for survival rather than display. Hulls bore old repairs layered over older ones, as if these vessels had lived long, violent lives and refused to die quietly. There, forming a wall, an aide whispered. It was true. Instead of spreading out, the human fleet compressed. Ships locked into tight, overlapping formations, covering one another with fields of fire. When one took a direct hit and began to break apart, two others slid forward to fill the gap without hesitation. The enemy pushed harder. Energy beams that had erased cities now slammed into human shields. Several ships vanished in expanding clouds of debris. Coalition officers flinched, waiting for the human line to shatter. It didn't. It bent. It burned. But it held. For the first time since the war began, evacuation ships broke free of the gravity wells. Refugee transports slipped past the human formation, engines screaming as they fled into open space. Human ships adjusted instantly, shifting angles, absorbing fire meant for defenseless civilians. They were bleeding, on purpose. Across the galaxy, the live feed spread. On wealthy core worlds, citizens stopped what they were doing to watch. Many had never seen battle before. Fewer still had seen a fleet willingly place itself between an enemy and strangers. In the council chamber, the reaction was far less emotional. This is inefficient, one representative said flatly, watching human losses climb. They will be destroyed. Another leaned forward. And yet they are buying time. More time than projected. Time changes nothing, a third replied. The coalition is still lost. A quiet voice spoke from the back of the chamber. Unless the humans are not here to win. That idea unsettled them more than the battle footage. On the front line, a human commander stood on a damaged bridge, emergency lights flashing red. The air smelled of burning circuitry. Reports scrolled too fast to read. Casualties, hull breaches, reactor strain. The commander did not raise their voice. Hold formation, they said calmly. Shift power from aft weapons to forward shields. Civilian transports are still exiting the system. An officer hesitated. Sir, that will leave our rear exposed. The commander nodded. I know. Another explosion rocked the ship. The deck tilted slightly as stabilizers struggled to compensate. Message from Coalition Command, a communications officer said. They're asking why we're doing this. The commander was silent for a moment. Then, tell them humanity learned a long time ago what happens when you decide some lives are worth less than others. On the enemy side, the delay triggered something worse. New shapes emerged from the heart of the Dark Fleet. Larger vessels, heavily armored, designed not for conquest, but for annihilation. Their weapons powered up, draining energy from entire sectors of the fleet. Space itself seemed to dim around them. Coalition sensors screamed warnings. These are extinction-class ships, an analyst whispered. Nothing survives direct engagement. The enemy fired. The first volley struck the center of the human line. 3 ships vanished instantly. Not exploded, erased, as if they had never existed. The formation buckled. Gaps opened. Enemy forces surged forward, eager to break through. For one terrible second, it looked like the end. Then the human response came. Not as panic, not as retreat, as precision. From behind the damaged line, Smaller human vessels surged forward. Ships the coalition had barely noticed. They moved fast, slipping through enemy fire with impossible timing. They slammed directly into the paths of the extinction weapons. Not firing, ramming. The impacts were catastrophic. Human ships shattered against enemy hulls, detonating reactors at point-blank range. The explosions did not destroy the enemy vessels, but they disrupted them. Weapon cycles failed. Energy fields collapsed. The extinction ships fell silent. Coalition officers stared at their screens in disbelief. They sacrificed themselves, someone said. The human commander closed their eyes for half a second. Just half. Reform the line, they ordered. We just bought another window. As the human fleet stabilized, something changed across the wider galaxy. Military analysts began running new simulations. Old assumptions about humanity were pulled from forgotten archives. The data no longer matched the reality unfolding live. Humans were not fighting to dominate territory. They were not protecting strategic assets. They were not even trying to survive at all costs. They were fighting to delay. And delay, the analysts realized with growing dread, was humanity's specialty. Centuries ago, humans had been fractured, divided by ideology, resources, fear. Their early wars were short, brutal, and wasteful. Then came the long ones. Wars that lasted generations. Conflicts where victory meant enduring longer than the enemy believed possible. Where survival depended on logistics, coordination, and sacrifice on a scale most species could not emotionally tolerate. Humanity had not forgotten how to fight. They had refined it. On Ilex, Governor Terran watched the sky burn and felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Hope, not the fragile kind. Not optimism. Something heavier. Something earned. The human fleet was shrinking. Losses mounted with every passing minute. But the enemy advance had slowed to a crawl. Entire attack patterns were being rewritten in real time to account for human behavior. Behavior no model had predicted. A new message came through. This one internal, leaking across encrypted channels due to signal saturation. It was not meant for the coalition. It was human to human. We are holding, but we cannot do this forever. The reply came almost instantly. We don't need forever. Just long enough. Long enough for what? The answer came sooner than expected. Deep within the enemy formation, energy readings spiked again, but this time, not from weapons. From engines. Massive ones. The enemy was preparing to deploy something new. Something final. Coalition sensors struggled to interpret the data. It's not a ship, an analyst said slowly. It's the structure. Mobile. Heavily shielded. A cold realization spread through command centers across multiple systems. The enemy was not just here to erase the coalition anymore. It was adapting to humanity. And whatever it was bringing next was meant to end the delay, for good. The human commander stared at the incoming data, jaw tightening. All units, they said quietly. Brace yourselves. They've noticed us. The human line held steady, battered and burning, as a shadow far larger than the others began to move. And for the first time since humanity announced itself to the galaxy, even they did not know what would come next. The structure unfolded like a wound opening in space. Coalition sensors struggled to track it, not because it was fast, but because it was wrong. Its mass readings fluctuated wildly, as if reality itself disagreed on how heavy it was supposed to be. Energy flowed through it in slow, pulsing waves, each one strong enough to power a city for a year. Enemy ships cleared a wide corridor, pulling back with mechanical precision. They were making room. On the coalition flagship, analysts spoke in hushed voices. That's not a command vessel, one said. It's not a carrier either. Another shook their head slowly. It's an execution platform. The structure finished unfolding. Plates locked into place. Vast apertures opened along its spine, glowing with a dim, hungry light. Targeting arrays aligned. Not on the human fleet. On the planets behind them. The message was clear. The delay was over. Governor Terran felt his breath catch. Evacuation was still incomplete. Millions were still planetside. Shelters had been built for bombardment, but not for what this thing promised. This is it, someone whispered. Across the human formation, alerts flared red. The human commander stared at the tactical display. They did not curse. They did not shout. Their voice, when it came, was calm enough to be unsettling. All ships, they said. Shift priority. An officer looked up sharply. Sir, forget the enemy fleet, the commander continued. That structure fires once, and everything behind us dies. Silence stretched for half a second. Then the order spread. Human ships broke formation. Not retreating, advancing. They surged forward, engines flaring beyond safe limits. Hulls already damaged screaming under the strain. Enemy fire intensified instantly, beams tearing into the advancing ships. The human fleet did not slow. Coalition commanders watched in disbelief as human vessels charged directly toward overwhelming firepower, toward a target no one believed could be reached in time. They can't stop it, an aide said, voice shaking. It's too far, too protected. The human commander leaned closer to the display. We don't have to stop it, they said. We just have to make it miss. As if in response, the execution platform began to fire. Space bent. A column of distorted light surged forward, not moving like a projectile, but unfolding, expanding across vast distances in seconds. It was aimed at the densest cluster of coalition worlds. The human fleet accelerated again. Several ships vanished mid-burn, torn apart by enemy intercept fire. Others lost engines, spinning helplessly into the dark. Still, enough of them pushed through. On the lead human vessel, alarms screamed as the reactor went critical. The captain stood unmoving, hands resting on the console. Course locked, the navigator said. We won't clear in time. The captain nodded once. I know. They opened a channel, not to command, not to allies, but to the crew. This is the captain, they said evenly. You all know what this ship was built for. You all chose to be here. No one replied. They didn't need to. The captain's final order was simple. Hold fast. The ship slammed into the outer edge of the execution beam. It did not explode. It detonated. The reactor overload tore a hole through the beam structure, warping its trajectory by a fraction of a degree. It was not much. It was nowhere near enough. Then another human ship followed. And another. One by one, human vessels threw themselves into the beam's path, sacrificing mass, energy, and lives to bend its course, each impact shifting it just a little more. Coalition sensors recalculated in real time. The beam was no longer aimed at population centers. It was drifting. The execution platform attempted to compensate. Systems strained. Energy surged unevenly through its frame. The human commander watched the numbers tick down. 30 seconds, an officer said. That's all we bought. Good, the commander replied. That's all we needed. Behind the front lines, something new came online. Coalition engineers had dismissed the signals at first, assuming they were debris echoes or electronic ghosts. But the patterns were too regular, too deliberate. Hidden among the human ships were arrays, compact, modular devices that had been deploying quietly since the first engagement. No one had noticed because they weren't weapons. They were anchors. Space around the execution platform shuddered as invisible forces latched on. The platform's immense mass began to resist its own movement, engines fighting against something that was not there, but very real. What is that? A coalition scientist whispered. The answer came from a human systems officer, voice tight with strain. Gravitational pinning. We're tying it to local space. That's impossible, the scientist said. You'd need a lot of ships, the human finished. Yes, we know. Human vessels burned out one by one as they fed power into the anchors. Reactors overloaded. Hulls cracked. Crews stayed at their stations until the last possible second. Some never left. The execution platform's beam flickered, then collapsed. A shockwave rippled across the battlefield as the structure's systems failed catastrophically. Enemy ships scattered, formations breaking for the first time. Coalition worlds were spared by the narrowest margin imaginable. Cheers erupted across civilian channels. Some cried. Some laughed hysterically. Many simply sat in stunned silence. The human fleet did not celebrate. They were too busy dying. Casualty reports flooded in. Entire squadrons were gone. Command ships lost. Communication relays destroyed. The human line was thinner than ever. And the enemy was not finished. From the shadows behind the shattered platform, new enemy vessels advanced, sleeker, faster, built to hunt. They ignored coalition ships entirely. They went straight for the humans. The message was unmistakable. The enemy had learned the pattern. Kill the ones who stand in front. On the human commander's bridge, damage crews worked frantically. The tactical display showed grim reality. If the enemy focused fire now, the human fleet would not survive another full engagement. An officer spoke softly. "Sir, if we pull back, the coalition might hold for a while." The commanders shook their head. "If we pull back," they said, "the galaxy learns the wrong lesson." They opened a wideband channel. This time, the message was not just for the coalition. It was for everyone. "We are humanity," the commanders said, voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We were forgotten because we chose not to rule." Across the galaxy, billions watched. "We were underestimated because we chose not to conquer." Enemy ships closed in, weapons charging. "But remember this," the commander continued. "When you decided some lives were expendable, you trained us for this moment." The human fleet reformed what little line it could. Battered ships slid into place. Fighters launched with barely enough fuel for one pass. "We stand," the commander finished. "Even when standing costs everything." The channel closed. Enemy weapons fired. And from deep, unexplored space, far beyond any known human territory, new signals began to emerge. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Coalition sensors struggled to process the sudden flood of contacts. A stunned analyst whispered, "Those aren't reinforcements." They paused, staring at the data. "Those are responses." The human commander looked up as the tactical display expanded, filling with new icons. And for the first time since the battle began, the enemy hesitated again, not because of sacrifice, but because it finally realized how many humans had been listening all along. The new signals did not arrive like a fleet. They arrived like a decision. Across the tactical displays of every watching species, the contacts did not form neat formations or recognizable battle groups. They appeared scattered, emerging from deep space, old jump points, unstable corridors, and regions long considered unusable. They came from everywhere humanity had gone quiet. Coalition analysts tried to classify them and failed. The ships varied wildly in size and shape. Some were massive, clearly built for war. Others were small, improvised, carrying signatures more common to cargo haulers or exploration craft. What united them was not design. It was direction. Every single one was moving toward the same place. The line. On the enemy side, something shifted. Their advance slowed, not from confusion, but reassessment. Targeting priorities changed. New firing solutions were calculated and discarded. The enemy had faced large fleets before. It had never faced convergence. On the human commander's bridge, the air felt heavier. Not from damage, but from realization. The commander stared at the incoming data, eyes scanning names, identifiers, call signs that had not been active in decades. Some were military. Some were civilian. Some were personal. An officer spoke carefully. "Sir, these signals aren't centralized. There's no unified command structure." The commander nodded. "I know." Another officer frowned. "Then how are they coordinating?" The commander's answer was quiet. "They're not." The first of the new arrivals dropped out of transit directly into the thick of enemy fire. It was an old human cruiser, hull patched with mismatched plates, engines running hot and uneven. It didn't ask for orders. It opened fire. Its weapons were outdated by modern standards, but it targeted weak points with terrifying accuracy. Enemy ships reeled, formations breaking under strikes that should not have been possible from such an old platform. Seconds later, a civilian transport arrived, its cargo bays gutted and replaced with improvised missile racks. It dumped everything it had in one devastating volley, then burned out its engines, ramming an enemy interceptor. More followed. Mining ships with reinforced hulls slammed into enemy lines. Exploration vessels deployed sensor jammers so dense they blinded entire enemy squadrons. Medical ships broadcast evacuation corridors while flying straight into combat zones to pull out the wounded, human and alien alike. Coalition commanders stared in disbelief. "They're not reinforcements," one whispered again, but this time their voice carried something new. "They're everyone." On a distant human colony world, long ignored by the galaxy, a family watched the broadcast in silence. The father reached over and turned off the feed. "It's time," he said simply. In orbit, an old defense platform, scheduled for dismantling years ago, came online for the first time since its construction. Its weapons powered up slowly, systems groaning with age. Its targeting data was already loaded. Humanity had not mobilized. Humanity had responded. On the battlefield, the enemy adapted again. Faster this time. New attack patterns formed, designed to isolate the newcomers, to pick them apart before they could integrate with the battered human line. It almost worked. The human fleet was exhausted. Damage was everywhere. Ammunition was low. Lives had already been spent beyond what most species would consider acceptable. But something fundamental had changed. The humans were no longer alone at the front. A battered frigate drifted into position beside the commander's ship, hull venting atmosphere. Its captain opened a channel without formalities. "We heard the call," the captain said. "Didn't know if you'd still be standing." The commander allowed themselves a thin smile. "We were hoping you'd be late." The frigate slid into formation. Then another. Then another. The line thickened, not with pristine warships, but with resolve. Enemy fire intensified, but now every strike was met by overlapping defenses. Ships rotated in and out of the front, covering one another with practiced ease. When one vessel faltered, two more took its place. This was not the precision of a single fleet. This was the muscle memory of a species that had learned cooperation the hard way. Coalition observers began to understand. Humanity's strength was not hidden superweapons or secret technology. It was redundancy. It was adaptability. It was the refusal to let failure cascade. Where one plan broke, another filled the gap. Where one ship fell, another replaced it. Losses hurt, but they did not paralyze. The enemy, for the first time, began to suffer delays. Not strategic ones, emotional ones. Their patterns showed hesitation where none had existed before. Retreat vectors were calculated and discarded. Attacks grew less efficient as human interference disrupted timing again and again. They were being forced to react. On Ilex, Governor Terran watched the sky and felt tears run down his face without shame. Human ships burned in orbit, falling like meteors. Some crashed into the planet's upper atmosphere, breaking apart in fire. But the city still stood. The children were still alive. A message came through on a civilian channel. Universal, unencrypted. "This is a human medical ship," a calm voice said. "We are entering your atmosphere. Prepare evacuation zones. We will land under fire if necessary." Terran sank into a chair. "Why?" he whispered, though no one could hear him. The answer came later, from a broadcast the humans did not intend to be inspiring. It was a recording pulled from human archives and replayed across the networks by accident. A simple statement, made centuries ago during one of humanity's forgotten wars. "If we don't stand for each other, no one else will." On the enemy flagship, internal systems re-evaluated the conflict for the first time since its beginning. Projections shifted. The cost of victory climbed rapidly. Humanity was not just slowing the advance. They were changing the outcome curve. The enemy began preparing contingency measures, responses not for winning, but for ensuring humanity could not recover afterward. Deep within their formation, engines charged again. This time, not toward coalition worlds, toward human space. The first warning came from a deep-range sensor buoy, far beyond the battlefield. A human officer stiffened as the data appeared. "Sir, they're bypassing us." The commander turned sharply. "To where?" The officer swallowed. "Multiple vectors. Human colonies. Old ones. Civilian heavy." Silence fell on the bridge. The enemy had learned the true pressure point. They could not break the human line quickly enough, so they would go around it. For a moment, a single, dangerous moment, the human commander felt doubt. Then the new arrivals answered before orders could be given. Civilian ships peeled away from the line, engines screaming as they reversed course. Mining vessels turned without hesitation. Defense platforms reoriented. Even damaged ships, barely holding together, began moving back toward human territory. They did not wait for permission. They did not ask for strategy. They knew. Coalition commanders watched as half the human presence split off, forming a second line that did not exist seconds earlier, one facing inward, toward their own worlds. "They're dividing their forces," an analyst said. "That's suicide." The commanders shook their heads slowly. "No," they said. "That's trust." Humanity was not choosing between protecting allies or protecting itself. It was doing both. At the same time, the enemy fired again, trying to exploit the split. The human line bent, but did not break. And across the galaxy, something irreversible happened. Species that had once calculated human worth purely in numbers began rewriting their understanding. Humans were not strong because they won. They were strong because they showed up. Again, and again, and again. As the battle raged on two fronts, a final realization spread through enemy systems. Cold, analytical, undeniable. Humanity could not be isolated. Humanity could not be frightened into retreat. Humanity could not be made to choose who deserved protection. They would stand in the way. Every time. The enemy adjusted its core directive for the first time in its existence. Humanity classified as existential obstacle. And far from the battlefield, deep within human space, something ancient and dormant began to wake, responding not to commands, but to the simple fact that humanity was, once again, standing together. The galaxy did not change its mind all at once. At first, it simply watched. Across core worlds and forgotten outposts alike, live combat feeds filled public channels. No one edited them. No one sanitized the images. Burning ships, fractured hulls, human vessels breaking apart as they held their positions anyway. Viewers expected fear. What they saw was refusal. On the Council's central world, traffic slowed as citizens stopped in the streets to stare at floating holo displays. They watched human ships rotate through the front lines, scarred vessels slipping back while fresher, if that word still applied, ships took their place. They watched humans abandon perfect formations to save damaged allies. They watched human pilots eject toward enemy fire so recovery craft could pull them out. They watched humans die buying seconds. At first, commentators framed it as desperation, then as recklessness, then, uneasily, as purpose. A military analyst on a major broadcast paused mid-sentence as new data scrolled across her screen. "This doesn't make sense," she said quietly. "Their casualty tolerance is beyond doctrine, beyond psychology." Her co-host frowned. "Then why are they still fighting?" She looked up at the feed, at a human ship drifting without engines, still firing with its last remaining turret to shield a retreating medical transport. "Because," she said slowly, "they've decided the cost already." On the battlefield, the split human response held, barely. The inward-facing line raced back toward human territory, pushing engines past limits, ships tearing themselves apart to gain speed. Enemy hunter squadrons pursued them, faster and more focused than anything seen so far. The outward line, what remained of the original defense, grew thinner by the minute. The human commander felt the strain in every report. Ammunition shortages, structural failures, crew losses climbing beyond acceptable margins. "Sir," an officer said, voice tight, "we can still withdraw the outer line. Regroup with the return forces. We'd lose the coalition worlds, but..." The commander cut them off gently. "But we would survive." The officer nodded, relief and shame flickering across their face. The commander stared at the tactical display. "And if we do," they said, "the galaxy learns something it can never unlearn." They opened a secure channel, not to Fleet Command, but to a civilian network. It was not a speech. It was a statement. "We are still here," the commander said. "If anyone is listening." The message spread faster than any military broadcast ever had. On a neutral trade world, a dock worker stopped mid-shift to watch. On a distant agricultural moon, farmers gathered around a battered terminal. On war-weary planets that had already surrendered to the enemy, survivors watched in silence. The humans were still standing. Not winning. Standing. Something began to crack. A junior representative on the council floor leaned forward, hands shaking. "They're holding the enemy with half a force. That's not possible." An older delegate replied flatly, "It shouldn't be." "Then maybe," the junior said, voice rising, "we were wrong." The chamber erupted in argument. Calculations were thrown onto shared displays. Projections updated in real time. The numbers were ugly, but they were no longer hopeless. Intervention was still costly, still dangerous, but now it was possible. On the battlefield, the enemy pressed its advantage. Their hunter squadrons closed on the retreating human forces, weapons charging for killing blows. A mining vessel, slow, bulky, never meant for combat, fell behind. Its engines sputtered, then failed completely. Enemy ships locked on. Before they could fire, something slammed into their path. A coalition corvette. Its markings identified it as one of the worlds originally abandoned. Its weapons were outdated. Its shields were weak. It should not have been there. It took the full brunt of the enemy volley and disintegrated instantly. The mining vessel escaped. Human sensors flagged the event. The commander stared at the report, disbelieving. Who authorized that? An officer asked. No one, another replied, voice shaking. They just turned around. Across the battle space, it happened again. A coalition frigate slipped into the outer line, weapons blazing. Then another. Then another. They were not coordinated. They were not efficient. But they were there. Coalition commanders began transmitting frantic warnings. You are not equipped for this engagement. Fall back. The replies were simple. You stood for us. It's our turn. We remember. The galaxy was no longer just watching. It was moving. On council channels, the vote that had once condemned the coalition resurfaced. Emergency measures were proposed. Defensive fleets redirected. Supplies released from stockpiles long guarded for core world security. Some delegates resisted, clinging to old fears. Others stood up and spoke words no one expected to hear. We misjudged them, one said, staring at the live feed. Not because they were weak, but because we forgot what strength looks like. The decision was not unanimous. It did not need to be. Aid convoys launched before the final vote concluded. On the battlefield, the human commander received the first confirmation. Sir, a communications officer said, eyes wide. Multiple non-human fleets are breaking formation from core sectors. They're heading this way. The commander closed their eyes. Late, they murmured. Then they opened them again. But welcome. Enemy forces reacted instantly. Their attack patterns shifted, abandoning optimal engagement zones to intercept the incoming allies. It created gaps. Human ships surged into them without hesitation. The fighting intensified, space filled with fire and debris, overlapping battles erupting across vast distances. It was chaos, but it was shared chaos. On Ilex, Governor Terran watched coalition ships return to orbit, not as targets, but as defenders. He watched human medical teams land under fire, pulling civilians from rubble while explosions lit the sky. A child pointed upward. They came back. Terran swallowed hard. Yes, he said. They did. The enemy adapted again, faster now, angrier. New weapons came online, designed to cripple fleets rather than destroy them. Whole sectors of space went dark as electronic warfare swept through the battlefield. Human ships lost coordination. For a moment, the line wavered. Then something unexpected happened. Individual ships, human and alien alike, began operating independently, forming microformations on the fly. Data was passed manually. Visual signals replaced network commands. It was inefficient. It worked. The enemy could not predict it. They had built their doctrine on breaking centralized control. Humanity, and now its allies, did not rely on it. As the battle dragged on, exhaustion set in. Crews fought with hands blistered and eyes burning. Damaged crews slept in minutes-long shifts between hull breaches. Still they held. Deep within enemy territory, internal calculations shifted again. Victory was still possible, but the cost was climbing too fast. A new directive propagated through their command structure. Escalation authorized. Energy signatures flared across multiple enemy vessels. Not weapons, but engines. Massive ones. Long range. They were turning away from the battlefield. The human commander felt the shift before the data confirmed it. They're disengaging, an officer said. Why would they? The answer hit like ice. They're not retreating, the commander said. They're going past us. To where? The commander didn't answer immediately. Then, Earth. The word rippled across the bridge. Earth. Humanity's origin. Its symbol. Its emotional core. The enemy had learned enough. If they could not break humanity at the line, they would break what made the line possible. Orders flew. Human and allied ships tried to pursue, but they were too damaged. Too slow. Too far. Only a fraction could follow. On the bridge, the commander straightened. All units, they said, voice carrying across every channel they could reach. The fight isn't ending. It's moving. They paused, then added something that was not in any doctrine. Wherever you are, go home. Across the galaxy, human ships turned. Not all toward Earth. Toward every human world. The enemy had made a fatal assumption. That humanity's heart was in one place. As the enemy fleet vanished into transit, racing toward what it believed was the final blow, something ancient and collective stirred across human space. Not fear. Resolve. And for the first time since the war began, the galaxy understood the truth too late. Humanity did not defend Earth because it was their home. Earth was their home because they defended each other. And whatever waited for the enemy at the end of that jump would not be undefended. Earth did not panic. When the warning arrived, fragmented, delayed, carried by ships that barely outran destruction, there was no screaming on the global channels. No riots. No desperate launches. There was silence. Then motion. Orbital traffic halted. Civilian lanes cleared. Ancient defense platforms, long dismissed as ceremonial relics, powered up for the first time in generations. Their systems groaned awake, pulling energy from grids that had not fed weapons in centuries. Across the planet, cities dimmed as power rerouted upward. Humanity had prepared for this moment without ever naming it. On the dark side of Earth, buried beneath layers of rock and shielding, command nodes activated one by one. Not a single central authority, but many. Regional, planetary, civilian military hybrids that had been designed to function even if cut off completely. Because humanity remembered something the galaxy did not. The first strike is never the last. A woman stood on a balcony overlooking a coastal city as evacuation sirens began. Not loud, not panicked, but steady and measured. She held her daughter close and watched the sky. "Is it them?" the child asked. "Yes," the woman said. "Are we going to lose?" The woman thought of the feeds she had watched. The ships that burned so others could escape. The voices that said we are still here. She shook her head. "No, we're going to stand." In orbit, Earth's defense grid came fully online. The enemy emerged from transit in tight formation, engines hot, weapons already charging. They had calculated perfectly. Earth's fleets were scattered, its defenders exhausted, its symbol exposed. What they found waiting was not a fleet. It was a planet that refused to be afraid. The first enemy volley struck the outer defense ring. Massive energy beams slammed into shields that flared white-hot, cracking but holding. Automated platforms returned fire immediately, not with overwhelming force, but with precision, targeting sensor arrays and formation anchors. Enemy ships adjusted. Earth adjusted faster. Defense platforms shifted positions, rotating constantly, never presenting the same configuration twice. Ground-based weapons fired through atmosphere-thinning corridors, their shots guided by real-time data fed from millions of civilian devices turned into passive sensors. Every human was watching. Every human was contributing. On the far side of the system, battered human ships arrived in ones and twos. Some limped into orbit trailing fire. Others barely made it out of transit before systems failed. They were not turned away. They were folded into the defense. A frigate with half its hull missing slid into position beside an orbital platform. Its captain didn't ask for orders. The platform didn't give any. They simply matched vectors. The enemy pressed harder. More ships poured into the system. Weapons fire intensified, turning space around Earth into a storm of light and debris. Losses mounted. Platforms fell. Ships died. Still, Earth did not break. On the surface, emergency shelters sealed. Medical teams moved. Supply chains rerouted themselves automatically, prioritizing energy, water, and communication. Humanity had learned, painfully, how to endure siege. Deep beneath the planet's crust, something else awakened. A system so old it predated humanity's first steps into space. Built not as a weapon, but as a promise. It took power from everywhere. Cities dimmed further. Some went dark entirely. A voice echoed across every human channel. "This is Earth." It was not a leader, not a general. It was the planet speaking through the systems built to protect it. "We are under attack." Across the galaxy, ships turned. Human, alien, coalition, independent. They turned not because they were ordered to. They turned because they had seen what standing together looked like, and they would not forget it now. Back at the original battlefield, the enemy felt it. Their forces there began to falter, patterns breaking as command priorities shifted toward Earth. That hesitation was enough. The remaining human and allied ships surged forward, pressing an advantage no one had expected them to still have. The enemy was now fighting on three fronts. At Earth, at the line, and within its own calculations. In orbit, the enemy deployed a final measure. A weapon designed not to destroy the planet, but to silence it. Energy readings spiked as a focused pulse built, aimed directly at Earth's magnetic core. If it fired, the planet would not explode. It would die, systems would fail, atmosphere would thin, civilization would collapse. The countdown began. On Earth, the activation was felt as a deep vibration, a low hum that rattled windows and bones alike. People held each other. Some prayed. Some simply watched the sky. In a command node beneath a mountain range, engineers stared at impossible equations scrolling across their screens. "It's too much," one whispered. "We can't stop it in time." Another shook their head. "Not from here." A third engineer looked up slowly. "What if we don't stop it from here?" Silence fell. Then understanding. Orders spread, not shouted, not debated. Executed. Across the system, human ships accelerated. Not toward safety, toward the weapon. They would not reach it in time to destroy it. They knew that. They didn't need to. The enemy weapon fired. A beam of destabilizing energy lanced toward Earth's core. It never arrived intact. Human ships intercepted it, not head-on, but at angles calculated to fracture and diffuse. They overloaded shields, burned out reactors, tore themselves apart to scatter the pulse. Alien ships joined them, mimicking the maneuver without fully understanding it. The beam shattered into fragments, washing over Earth's magnetic field like a storm instead of a blade. Damage was severe, but the planet lived. The enemy weapon destabilized under the strain. Its systems overloaded. Internal failures cascaded. Earth's defenses seized the moment. Everything fired. Orbit lit up as coordinated volleys struck the crippled enemy vessel. Its shields failed. Its hull cracked. It did not explode. It collapsed in on itself, torn apart by forces it had unleashed and could not control. The enemy fleet hesitated. Just for a moment. That moment was enough. From deep space, Allied fleets arrived, too late to save lives already lost, but in time to end the threat. They poured into the system, weapons blazing, targeting enemy ships already strained, already uncertain. The enemy began to retreat. Not strategically, desperately. On Earth, the voice returned. "We are still here." The message echoed across every channel, picked up by worlds that had once turned away. The battle was not over, but the enemy had failed at the one thing it believed would end everything. Breaking Earth. As the surviving enemy ships fled, carrying data, losses, and something new, doubt, humanity took stock of the cost. Cities damaged, millions displaced, countless dead, but Earth stood, and so did the line. Across the galaxy, a realization settled in, heavy and unavoidable. Humanity was no longer a forgotten species. It was a constant, a force that did not expand to dominate, a force that did not retreat when threatened, a force that would absorb unimaginable pain for one simple reason. No one gets left behind. And as the enemy regrouped in the dark between stars, preparing something even worse, humanity and its allies did something unprecedented. They did not chase. They prepared. Together. Because the galaxy was about to learn the final truth. Standing together was not humanity's declaration. It was their warning. The galaxy did not celebrate Earth's survival. Not yet. There was relief, yes, but it was thin, fragile, stretched over the growing understanding of what it had cost. Every major network replayed the same images. Human ships tearing themselves apart to break the enemy's killing beam. Cities darkened to feed planetary shields. Fleets arriving just moments too late to save millions. Earth lived. Humanity bled. Across human space, emergency status did not lift. It deepened. Colonies sealed themselves. Civilian production converted overnight. Schools became shelters. Shipyards worked without pause. Crews sleeping in shifts measured in minutes. No speeches were made. Humanity had passed beyond the need for them. In a damaged orbital station above Earth, the human commander from the line stood before a wide tactical display. Their uniform was scorched, one arm bound in emergency synth fabric. Around them, officers from a dozen species worked side by side in strained silence. The display showed the truth no one wanted to say out loud. The enemy had withdrawn, but not far. They were regrouping beyond sensor range, in deep interstellar voids where physics grew unreliable and conventional pursuit was impossible. Probes sent after them vanished. Long-range scans returned distorted echoes. They were not retreating. They were preparing. An alien strategist broke the silence. "They've lost more than projected." Why not disengage entirely? The commander didn't look away from the display. Because they don't fear loss. They turned slowly, meeting the strategist's eyes. They fear precedent. The room stilled. Human analysts brought up comparative models. The enemy's behavior was changing, not tactically, but philosophically. They were no longer focused on expansion efficiency or territorial control. Their projections centered on one variable: humanity. Every future scenario where humans survived showed the same result: resistance spreading, alliances forming, systems refusing to comply quietly. The enemy had never needed total victory before. Now they did. They're going to try to erase us, an officer said quietly. Not Earth. Not the colonies. Us, the commander confirmed. As an idea, the conclusion followed naturally. They'll come back, the officer continued. With everything. A coalition admiral spoke for the first time. Then we must strike first. The commander shook their head. No, they said. We won't survive a war of annihilation. They tapped the display. New data appeared. Internal human fleet movements, energy transfers, classified systems activating across dozens of worlds. We'll survive a war of sacrifice. The plan was not shared immediately. Not because it was secret, but because it was heavy. It spread through command layers slowly, carefully, accompanied by silence instead of debate. When it reached the fleet captains, none refused. Some asked for clarification. Most did not. The enemy returned sooner than expected. They emerged across multiple fronts at once. Massive formations punching into human-controlled space, bypassing defended worlds, ignoring strategic targets. They were not here to conquer. They were here to end resistance. Entire systems burned in minutes. Human fleets engaged wherever they could, but the scale was overwhelming. Enemy ships ignored losses, pushing forward relentlessly, forcing defenders into desperate holding actions. And everywhere the same pattern emerged. Human ships held. They did not counterattack. They did not pursue. They anchored. They planted themselves in enemy paths and refused to move. Losses skyrocketed. Across the galaxy, allies watched in horror as human fleets were chewed apart system by system. Emergency calls flooded in, begging humanity to fall back, to regroup, to preserve what remained. The human reply was always the same. Hold your position. At the center of human space, something began to form. A convergence so massive it bent strategic projections into uselessness. Energy flowed inward from dozens of systems. Entire colonies dimmed. Orbital habitats shut down non-essential life support. Civilian power grids collapsed under redirected load. On Earth, the ancient system awakened fully. It had no official name. It never had. It was simply known, in old human doctrine, as the last measure. Built after humanity's earliest interstellar wars, when they had learned that survival sometimes meant choosing how you fell, it was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a promise, a networked overload. If triggered, it would cascade through human space, collapsing every jump corridor, every long-range gate, every deep space anchor humanity had ever built. Humanity would lose faster than light travel. Forever. Human space would fracture into isolated pockets, cut off from one another, technologically crippled, unable to project power ever again. But so would the enemy. Their fleets, deep inside human territory, would be trapped, stranded, unable to regroup, unable to retreat, unable to finish the job. The cost was unthinkable. The alternative was extinction. The final decision was not made by one leader. It was made by millions. Across human worlds, a simple query appeared on public networks. No force, no coercion. Authorize the last measure? There were no countdowns. No pressure. The enemy advanced. Human ships died buying time. And then, one by one, the confirmations came. Yes, yes, yes. On Earth, the system began to charge. Enemy sensors detected the surge too late. Panic rippled through their formations as projections updated wildly. They tried to pull back. They couldn't. Human ships surged forward, not to attack, but to lock enemy fleets in place, to keep them within the collapse radius. The final broadcast went out, not as a threat, not as a boast, as an explanation. We were left to die once, the human commander said, voice echoing across every channel still open. The galaxy decided some lives were acceptable losses. The enemy closed in, firing wildly, tearing through the last human defenses. We learned from that. The commander looked around the shattered bridge, at officers who had chosen to stay when evacuation orders had been given. We learned that survival means standing together, even when it costs everything. The last measure activated. Space screamed. Jump lanes folded in on themselves. Gates collapsed into blinding implosions. Energy surged across human space in a chain reaction that rewrote navigation forever. Enemy fleets vanished, not destroyed, but trapped, stranded in systems that could no longer support them. Human ships caught in the collapse burned out, reactors failing as the energy wave passed. Across the galaxy, silence fell. When it ended, the stars looked different. Human space was smaller now, quieter, broken. The enemy was gone, not defeated in glory, but neutralized, scattered, unable to function as a unified force ever again. The cost was devastating. Entire human worlds were isolated. Fleets lost contact with home forever. Technology humanity had relied on for centuries was gone in a single moment. The galaxy waited. For rage. For collapse. For humanity to finally fall apart. Instead, something unexpected happened. Human worlds, cut off and alone, did not panic. They rebuilt locally. They adapted. They endured. Allied worlds began reaching out, slower than before, through dangerous, old routes humanity had once abandoned. Supplies arrived. Messages followed. We are here, they said. Months later, a new gathering formed. Not a council, not an empire. A circle. Worlds that had stood. Worlds that had learned. At its center was a simple human principle, written into its founding charter. No one gets left behind. Humanity did not lead the galaxy by force. They could no longer do that. They led it by example, by paying a price no one else had been willing to pay. And as historians would later record, the enemy never returned, not because it was destroyed, but because it finally understood something the galaxy had ignored for too long. Humanity would stand together, even if standing meant breaking the stars themselves. The galaxy did not know how to speak after the stars went quiet. For the first time in recorded history, faster-than-light maps were wrong. Routes that had existed for centuries were gone, folded into nothing. Beacons blinked out one by one. Familiar paths became dead ends, and entire regions of space felt suddenly farther away, not in distance, but in certainty. Human space was fractured, not destroyed. Fractured. On Earth, the sky was darker than it had ever been. Not from smoke or fire, but from absence. Orbital traffic was gone. The constant movement humanity had grown used to, ships arriving, departing, crossing the night, had vanished. People stood outside and looked up anyway. They were not afraid of the dark. They were counting who was still there. Emergency networks stabilized slowly. Communication within systems held. Between systems, it was harder. Messages sent along old, dangerous routes that took weeks or months to arrive, carried by ships that could not rely on shortcuts anymore. The first reports came in fragments. Colonies isolated but intact. Fleets stranded but alive. Worlds damaged, grieving, rebuilding. Humanity had not fallen apart. It had been scattered, and still it endured. In a quiet command center beneath Earth's surface, the human commander sat alone. The uniform they wore was no longer a symbol of authority, just fabric, stained and worn. A console flickered to life, showing delayed transmissions arriving one by one. A colony world, cut off, reporting that they had already begun repairing orbital farms using local materials. A fleet captain, stranded with allied ships, stating simply, "We're holding. We'll find a way home." A message from a child on a distant moon, sent through 3 relays and 2 blind jumps. "We're okay. Tell everyone we're okay." The commander closed their eyes. The price had been paid. Now came the living with it. Across the galaxy, other worlds were also adjusting. Empires that had once measured power and territory now faced borders that meant less than they used to. Trade slowed. Influence faded. And with it came reflection. Uncomfortable, unavoidable. They replayed the old recordings. The votes. The declarations of non-viable. The moment the galaxy decided it could afford to look away. And then they replayed what followed. Human ships standing in front of worlds that were not theirs. Human voices saying we are still here. Humanity breaking its own future so others could have won. For many, it was the first time in generations that shame outweighed pride. Months passed. Then years. Slow routes reopened. Dangerous corridors were charted. Old sublight convoys returned, carrying supplies, stories, and memory. Where once there had been a galactic council, there was now something quieter, smaller. Representatives met in rotating locations, sometimes on human worlds, sometimes not. No grand chamber, no elevated seats, just circles. They spoke not of dominance, but of responsibility, of who would stand when standing was costly. Humanity did not demand leadership. They were offered it, and they refused it. Instead, they offered something else. A principle. It was written into every new accord, every shared defense pact, every reconstruction charter. It appeared in different languages, shaped by different cultures, but the meaning never changed. No one gets left behind. It was not a slogan. It was a warning. On a distant frontier world, years after the war, a small alien child asked a human teacher why the stars on the map looked broken. The teacher smiled gently. Because someone once chose to break them instead of breaking people. Who? The child asked. The teacher thought for a moment. Everyone who stood. Far beyond known space, remnants of the enemy drifted, isolated, scattered, no longer a single force. They observed. They remembered. Their calculations no longer asked how to win. They asked whether resistance was worth provoking again. Every projection ended the same way. Humanity did not need to conquer the galaxy. They had already changed it. By proving that unity was not a weakness. That sacrifice could be strategic. That standing together was not an emotion, but a choice, made again and again, even when it hurt. And so, when future crises came, as they always do, worlds did not wait for permission. They remembered the line that should not have held. The planet that did not run. The species that refused to decide who deserved to live. History would not remember humanity as the strongest. It would remember them as the ones who stood when no one else would. And long after the stars were redrawn, one truth remained, carried quietly from world to world. The galaxy once left humanity to die, and humanity answered, "We will stand together."